Good evening, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us for those technical difficulties. Welcome to our community Yom Hashoah commemoration. And I'd first like to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and especially staying on so that we can meaningfully observe Yom Hashoah together as we should, despite any extra challenges, so that we can remember and pay tribute to all those who were murdered in the Holocaust and also honor all those who survived and lived on to build a future. I'd like to thank all of the shuls and communities who are participating tonight, who are sponsoring tonight's event, and who helped organize it. My name is David Hellman. If you don't know me, I stand here at the Young Israel of Brookline, and we are happy to be one of the partnering synagogues. We are partnering also with the Adam Street Shul, Beit Sasson Sephardic Congregation of Newton, Congregation Beth El Atereth Israel, Congregation Kadima Toras Moshe, Congregation Sharei Tefillah, Harvard Hillel Orthodox Minyan, and Maimonides Kehila. In just a couple of minutes, you will first see, we'll begin our program with a video from the artist Ilana Yahav, a video originally produced for the Federation of Greater Philadelphia. After that, we'll hear reflections from two children of survivors who live in our shared communities, Janet Stein-Calm and Dr. David Fisher. And then we'll conclude with lighting memorial candles for the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, reciting the malei memorial prayer, and singing Hatikva. In an op-ed by Brett Stevens published this week in the New York Times, entitled, "Can We Really Picture Auschwitz?" The op-ed discusses that the Holocaust, since it is so unimaginable, so incomprehensible to fathom the extent of its destruction, the amount of human suffering, and the magnitude of its evil, that facts and numbers and historical accounts simply make us numb. Statistics do not impart a meaningful understanding of it. And sometimes, the op-ed writes, it can be art, which does not seek to convey objective facts or data, but rather attempts to open our eyes, to convey feelings, to share perspectives. Sometimes it is art that can break down walls and help us understand a little bit better what the Holocaust was. And so in that vein, we hope that this video from artist Ilana Yahav will capture the right spirit, and we hope that it will place us in the right state of mind and open our hearts for tonight's program.
Wow. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Benjamin Samuels from Congregation Sharei Tefillah. Yesterday in the Israeli press, I read an article which related that since Yom Hashoah of last year, 14,264 Holocaust survivors in Israel have since passed away. There are currently 174,500 survivors still living in Israel, and another 200,000 survivors elsewhere in the world. May they all enjoy good health, long life, and abundant nachas. However, as is the way of all flesh, dor holech v'dor ba, the generation of survivors and eyewitnesses will ultimately, may it be many years hence, will take their leave from this world. And the burden of memory and retelling the testimony of survivors will fall upon us, and then upon our children, and then upon our grandchildren, and so on and so forth after us. The official name of Holocaust Remembrance Day is Yom Hashoah v'Hagvura, Holocaust Remembrance and Heroism Day. Heroism referring to the Jewish resistance during the Shoah, like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which took place at this time of year. But heroism also refers to the courage that we have to rise up to, the courage so that we will never forget. It is my honor this evening to introduce two speakers, children of Holocaust survivors, sometimes known as second-generation survivors, because of the presence that the Holocaust has in the life of families of survivors. We first will hear from Miss Janet Stein-Calm, who's a member of the Brookline Jewish community, president of the Greater Boston chapter of the American Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and their Descendants. Janet, please tell us a little bit of your father's story.
I apologize. I thought I had been unmuted. I will start again. Do your grandchildren know your name? My father was born in Hungary, and it was just a few months after he became a bar mitzvah that his mother asked him to go to Budapest to get information about coming to America, where he had an uncle in Chicago. Upon his return, everything had changed. His family and the entire Jewish community where he lived were all gone. He would later learn that the Nazis had invaded and taken all the Jews. My father knew that he could not stay in his house and that he would need to find a place to hide. But he decided to go back into the house one more time to get something. Eventually, he too was found and taken to a concentration camp. When the war ended a few years later, my father was liberated from Mauthausen. The International Red Cross did several things for those that had survived. Initially, they weighed them. My father, now almost 16, weighed a mere 90 pounds. They also tried to help reunite families. They asked my father for the names of his mother, his father, his brother, his sister, and any other relatives. How many children would not know the names of their grandparents or uncles? The International Red Cross also helped to relocate survivors to DP camps, displaced persons camps, where they were held while they tried to find family members in places where survivors could be taken. One by one, my father was told that each and every member of his family had been killed in Auschwitz. Each person he knew before the war, each person from his neighborhood, from his shul, and every kid he went to school with had all been killed. He was the only person that he knew before the war who was still alive after the war. My father was given a chance to come to the United States only because it was now 2 weeks before his 18th birthday and he could still be classified as an orphan of the war. He did not come on a cruise ship or a plane. He came on a US military vessel. He was aboard the SS Ernie Pyle. That one last time that he went back into his family home, he did not take food, he did not take clothes or toys or family heirlooms. The one thing my father thought to take were a few small black and white photographs of his family. At 13, he must have known in his heart that he would never see them again. He held on to those pictures while he was in hiding, while he was in a concentration camp, and later when he was in a DP camp. One day, my father went out on the deck for fresh air. He had never been out on the ocean before. He took the photographs out from his shoe. They must have been worn out and faded and torn and crinkled on the edges. As he held the pictures in his hand, a gust of wind came and quickly threw the pictures overboard. My father described reaching out to try and grab back those pictures. Perhaps in some way, this was my father's chance to bury his loved ones at sea. Yom Hashoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, is not a day for the survivors to remember what happened during the war. To them, each day is Holocaust Remembrance Day. They live with the nightmares of terrible memories every day. What this day really is a day for each of us to mark the yortzites, the anniversaries of the death of loved ones, and of the 6 million that most of us never even knew, but who deserve to be remembered. After my father was in this country for just a few years, he received a letter from the President of the United States asking him to report to the local Army office. He had been drafted. My father was not yet a US citizen, and if he told them what he had been through during World War II, they would have excused him from the Army. But my father knew that it was US soldiers who liberated him and US soldiers who brought him to this country. So he knew that this was a way for him to pay them back for saving him. For many years, I worked with a woman who never had a chance to meet her father. He enlisted in the war, leaving his pregnant wife back home. He died in Europe and was buried there in one of the fields with rows and rows of white crosses. 65 years later, my work colleague decided that she wanted to take a trip to Europe and to stand at her father's cross, Kever Avot, for a father she never knew. Before going, she did some research. Army records are well documented and can be found online. She discovered that he landed on the beaches of Normandy and survived, and that he was part of the 11th Armored Division. His Jeep was in the lead position when his division advanced into Central Europe. The Jeep hit a mine, and he and the driver were killed. The remainder of his division continued, and on May 5th, 1945, they liberated Mauthausen. After years of working together, we discovered that she lost a father that she never had a chance to know on his way to saving my father. What is Grandma's name? Most children probably only know the name they call her, Bubby, Grandma, Nana, Savta. So much was taken from the survivors, regardless of their own experience during the war, whether they were in concentration camps, in ghettos, given to strangers, or hiding in the woods. Each person was robbed out of what should have been their lives, their communities, their schools, their homes, their things, their families, and their friends. And most lost someone. Some lost many, and others, like my father, lost everyone. Children never had a chance to even get to know that Grandma had a name. May the 6 million who perished rest in peace, knowing that we are here to observe Yom Hashoah. May they know that there were survivors and that now there are generations born in freedom and children of survivors who never knew their grandmothers have all been taught their Bobby's name. I am named for the grandmother I never met. I have never seen a picture of her, but I know her name was Malva Schwartz Stein. But I have no idea what her mother's name was. My father only knew her as Grandma, or as he would have said in Hungarian, Nagymama. She was loved by her grandchildren and was 90 years old when she was killed in Auschwitz. Her name erased from this world. There is no grave to visit, no stone with her name to discover. Yom HaShoah is the day I consider to be the yortzeit of my father's family. My father's father, his mother, his sister, his brother, and the yortzeit of his grandmother. May she rest in peace, and may her neshama have an aliyah. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, for those powerful words. It's now my privilege to introduce Dr. David Fisher. David, his wife Claire, and their family, along with his parents, Hans and Ruth Fisher, who are Holocaust survivors, are all members of Congregation Bethel Ateret Israel here in Newton. David has served as the president, the chairman of the board, and the chairman of Bethel's Holocaust Committee. David is also the chief of Mass General Hospital's Department of Dermatology. Thank you for speaking, David.
Thank you. So I think my story is similar to many and yet distinct, as every story is different. And I'll share perspective of some of the history and also some of the impressions that I've had as a child growing up with parents who escaped Nazi Germany. It began, at least the worst part of the nightmare began on Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938. The next morning on the 10th, both of my grandfathers, my mother's and father's fathers, were arrested. My father's father was taken to Buchenwald. My mother's father was taken to the concentration camp called Sachsenhausen. Both of my grandmothers were educated and working women. Both of my grandfathers had law degrees. My mother's father was actually a judge, which was quite uncommon for Jews. He was also a colleague of Martin Buber's and had written essays together with him. So they were arrested in November, but actually several months later, they were both of my grandfathers were actually released. And the reason they were released is because they were veterans of the German army in World War I. And I remember actually as a small child seeing this little red cross, this iron cross, which actually was one of my grandfather's iron crosses from his service in World War I that actually earned him the opportunity to leave the concentration camp with the stipulation that he would leave the country of Germany within 2 weeks. This was not entirely good. In fact, World War I was a huge tragedy. There was an uncle of my father, a group of uncles, three brothers who were consecutively killed as soldiers. One family virtually wiped out as soldiers, Jewish soldiers, in World War I. My father's father, leaving within 2 weeks of his release from the concentration camp, went to Cuba, the only place that a visa was available. And then the rest of the family departed from Germany on the well-known boat, the St. Louis. And my father, we are very blessed to have my parents here and members of our shul and our community. And I think maybe listening, although I'm not sure. My father has actually spoken about his experience on the St. Louis. I won't talk about that today. My mother's family, actually an extended family, left in February 1939. And this extended family took a boat through the Panama Canal down to Santiago, Chile, because there was an uncle who happened to be living there and was able to obtain visas for the extended family to go to Chile. I recently heard from my father what his sense was of the experience in the concentration camp of his father in Buchenwald, because his father apparently never said a word of his experience there in multiple months. But my father had a unique coincidence when a colleague asked him at Rutgers University, where my father was on the faculty, to translate a letter in German. And this letter happened to be written by somebody who had been an inmate at Buchenwald at that very same time. And in the letter happened to be describing what the experience was like. And that's where my father learned that there were beatings and punishments and killings, and even details such as the fact that there was insufficient water for the inmates to be drinking, yet the inmates each morning had to wake up and wash the shoes with water for the officers who were there. So numerous relatives on both sides of my parents' families, including their grandparents, for example, never made it out. The vast majority, all but a very few, perished. But I do remember vividly when my father turned 80 years old, he took a 3-generation trip of our family to visit their hometown, Breslau, Germany, which was now Wrocław in Poland, as well as nearby concentration camps. We also visited the graves of these, and we were able to find the graves of those brother soldiers who were killed in World War I in a Jewish cemetery that actually was still possible to visit. And this is not that many years ago, 15 years ago or so. We also visited Theresienstadt, and Theresienstadt was one of the concentration camps where many of our relatives were murdered. And as you know, the meticulous data sheets that were available and now were computerized allowed us to search for the names of the relatives that my parents, whose names they could remember. And it was very striking how there was this inverse mathematical correlation between how old a relative was and how short their duration of survival was. The older they were, the shorter they lived. And obviously a little bit younger, they could live a bit longer, with virtually nobody surviving. The cause of death usually being starvation or disease. And we did also visit the crematoria in that same concentration camp. I remember as a child, only 2 countries we would visit that would not be, if we would leave this country. We would visit Israel and we would visit Santiago, Chile. And I remember visiting my grandmother in Chile, how not only was it a beautiful country, but there was a message frequently conveyed to me of how kind the people of this country had been in welcoming the Jews, unlike so much of the rest of the world at that time. So where did I learn the story? I learned the story, for example, of the St. Louis, Right before my bar mitzvah, my grandfather, who's had escaped and whose family, the rest of that family had been on the St. Louis, he had passed away shortly before my bar mitzvah. And my father called us all around the kitchen table and sat down and told us what the story was. And we also learned that there had been family who had left earlier from Germany, this extended family. There were some who had been to Israel earlier, a cousin approximately my father's age, who to this day is a rancher in southern Israel, in Arad in the desert, a very tough guy, but with a heart of gold, and others who had traveled to escape the Nazis, and some of whom had actually made it. Others, I was not long ago at a meeting in Sydney, Australia, and my father said, you really have to look up my cousin because I think he's there, and I think he's actually at the medical school. It turned out to be the chair of anesthesiology, a wonderful person. The scattering of the Jews across the globe affected so many families. And virtually all the relatives who ended up in Chile in South America in 1948 lifted up and made Aliyah to Israel. Our relatives in Israel are numerous, spanning black hats to communists, literally, Orthodox kibbutzim to the complete opposite, and yet all of them exceptionally loving and warm and welcoming, not only to us, but also to each other. I also remember vividly the cousins who, upon completing their service in the Israeli army, would come and spend, now I think they go to the Far East, but at that time they came to America. They often came and they stayed in our house. And I distinctly remember, they were older than me, cousins who had served in the Israeli army during the Six-Day War, teaching me the story of the Israeli Air Force decimating the Egyptian Air Force before a single Egyptian airplane had even taken off. Incredibly inspiring to a little kid. So what were my observations as a child? Primarily, I think this was my inspiration in seeing my parents. So my dad only was able to go to college because he was valedictorian of the Vineland High School, the Vineland, New Jersey public high school. There was no chance they would have been able to pay for him to go to college. But in the state of New Jersey, if you were valedictorian, you were given free tuition at Rutgers University, the state university. And from there, he ended up getting a PhD. He became a very department chair, a very successful academic and researcher, and had a distinguished academic career. My mother, unfortunately, suffered another terrible tragedy in Chile when her father died in a tragic accident in his 40s when she was the age of 17. She had to drop out of high school to work to support the family. And to this day, I feel my mother is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, but she has no high school diploma. She's entirely self-taught. And she actually also taught herself to become a musician, a very impressive musician. So I watched two of the hardest working, most committed, idealistic, yet enormously pragmatic parents. Their response to Hitler was to turn towards each other and towards their three children, preparing us with education, both scholastically and very much musically as well. This meant, for example, 50-mile drives each way early Sunday mornings so that I could have cello lessons, searching endlessly to find affordable violins and cellos that would sound like better than a cigar box because they were expensive, we couldn't afford them, supporting us playing classical music when virtually nobody in our public school system played classical music, and actually discovering we weren't that bad because we were answering to the standards of my mother rather than our peers. Although I don't recall discussions about my choice of medicine as a career, it's probably no accident that I and my brother are both doctors and my sister is a clinical psychologist. I do remember somewhere along the line, my mom saying, doctors will always have a place to work, given that both of their fathers had been in legal training, legal professions, not something that will help you very much in Cuba or in Santiago, Chile. And Judaism, of course, was a core of our existence. My father became shul president. I noticed this at a young age. This motivated me later on to do the same despite a very busy schedule. And of course, enormously passionate support for Israel. How could that not have been influenced by the experience of floating on the St. Louis, heading back to Europe after rejection from the world, including the United States of America and Franklin Roosevelt? Commitment to Israel was always and is always a very high priority. And finally, I still find myself sometimes still reflecting when a big achievement may occur, a significant award or recognition, that, as so many people say, this is again a tiny little triumph over Hitler. But I know, unfortunately, there were pockets of triumph, but still huge, irreplaceable oceans of permanent loss. So one of our greatest missions, I believe, into the future as children of survivors is to push forth to the best of our abilities for the sake of our families, for the sake of Israel, and for the sake of our people. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Rabbi Jason Strauss. I'm here at Congregation Kedumat Torah Moshe Shul. I want to thank our speakers tonight for sharing their family stories and helping us focus on the individual stories of survivors and families. Just a week ago, right before Shabbat, right before the second days of Pesach, many of our families, many of us, probably lit yahrzeit candles, not only for the purpose of making sure that we have a fire so that we lit fire so we can light candles on the second night, on the 8th night of Pesach, but also because we're going to say Yizkar on the 8th day. And many have a practice to have a yahrzeit candle lit in memory of whoever we are going to be saying Yizkar for on that day. And the Pnei Baruch, in his book on the laws of Avelut, the laws of mourning, he explains that the practice of lighting a candle, a yahrzeit candle, in memory of those who passed, it's not just a ritual. It's meant to serve as a reminder, a constant reminder throughout the day of the yahrzeit, not only of the memories of the person who passed, not only of who they were, but also a reminder to us that we should be inspired by that fire, inspired by the memory of those people, to do mitzvot, to daven, to do acts of kindness as a zechut for those who have passed. And so now, before me, I hope you can see, we have 6 yahrzeit candles. 6 yahrzeit candles to memorialize 6 million Jews who passed, a quarter of whom were children, many of whom never had anyone to say Yizkar for them, never had anyone to light a candle for them, because there was no one in their family left close enough to them that they could memorialize them later. And so somehow, these few candles, in just the few moments that we have together, somehow that's supposed to serve a similar purpose, a parallel purpose of inspiring us to do good. And so I think we have to work that much harder to have more kavanah, more focus as we're looking at these candles, as we're lighting these candles. As we have silent reflection in lighting these candles, how are these candles going to inspire us in just those few moments to not only remember millions of people that we never met and whose names we will, because of the sheer number of people who passed away, we will never be able to remember all of them at once. Despite that, we need to somehow allow these candles to inspire us to action. Action in performing mitzvot, action in defying the intent of the Nazis in Yimach Shemam, in helping Yiddishkeit grow stronger and stronger. And we need to let these candles inspire us to not only do mitzvot, but also to feel empathy with other people who have suffered, other Jews, and also other people throughout the world, and to make sure that we are inspired to never let something like this happen again to the Jewish people or to anyone else. So in just these few moments as I'm going to be lighting the candles, I would ask all of us to just silently think, look at the flames, and not only remember the people who passed as best as we can, thinking of individual stories that we remember, but also to think about what are the things that these candles are going to change in us so that going forward, we are not the same people. We've learned some lesson and we're going to do something positive as a zechut for the memory of the 6 million. So I'm not going to light those candles, and let us have that kavanah together.
El malei rachamim, Dayan almonos, Vavi yisomim, Al nasech eshe, Visis apak, Lidam Yisrael, Shenishbach kamoyim, Hametzei Menucha Nechona, Al Kanfei HaShechina, B'malos Kedoshim Utehorim, Kezohar Harakia, Meirim Umazehirim, Linishmosehem, Shel Rivivos Alfei Yisrael, Anoshim, Vinoshim, Yiladim Vilados, Shenehergu, Venishchatu, Venisrifu, Venechneku, Venikberu Chaim, Boarotzos, Asher Naga Bohen, Yad Hatzorer Hagermani Ugeru Arav, Kulam Kedoshim Uteharim, Uvahem Geonim V'tzadikim, Arezei Halevonon, Adirei Torah, Beganei Eden Tehei Menuchasam Lachein, Baal Harachamim Yastirem, B'seiser Kenafav, Lialamim, V'yitzeror, Bitzror HaChaim Es Nishmasam, Adonai, Hu Nachalosam, V'yanucha b'shalom al mishkavam, v'nomar Amen. Kolod balevav penima, nefesh Yehudi homia, ulefate mizrach Kodima Ayin Litzion Sophia Od lovda tikvateinu Hatikva bat shenot alpayim lios am chofshi be'artzeinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim Lios Amechofishi Biartzeinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. Thank you, everyone, for participating. A special thank you to Janet and David for sharing such personal and meaningful thoughts. And we end on Hatikva on that positive note. And this concludes our program for this evening. Everyone should have a good night.